Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for module number 9. This video is about second inversion triads in figured bass. We've already done first inversion triads, and now we're going to talk about second inversion triads and why they are used in music. So the objectives for this video are to review second inversion triads, so refreshing our memories about what they are, to understand why second inversion triads are used in music, and to recognize all types of second inversion triads in figured bass, and then to work on completing figured bass exercises with those second inversion triads. So a quick little review again of triads. As we know, triads can be in different positions or inversions. Each position, each inversion has a different part of the triad as its lowest pitch. And the one we're dealing with today is the second inversion triad. And as you remember, the second inversion triad has the fifth of the chord in the bass, right? So that chord all the way on the right was just an F major triad with the fifth of the chord in the bass. The C is the lowest note. All right. And so, like I said, they're all the same triad, just in different positions. They're all F chords, but this one is in second inversion. Okay. And so let's talk about the way we notate that. So triads in different positions have different intervals above their lowest note, above the bass note. We talked about the intervals that are in a root position triad, the fifth and the third. And then for the first inversion triads, they have a third and a sixth. And for the second inversion triads, the one we're dealing with today, they have a fourth. So here we have D to G, that's a fourth, and a sixth. So no fifths and no thirds. And the figured bass for a second inversion triad is the number 6 and 4. And the bass position symbol, the thing you attach to a Roman numeral or put under a figured bass, is the same. It's 6, 4. Okay. So the thing about second inversion triads is that they are considered to be unstable. And there's a lot of reasons for it. One reason is that it has a sixth and a fourth in it, right? And we're used to triads having a third and a fifth. So they sound unusual because they don't fit into that normal plan of triads, having a third and a fifth, right? Plus, that interval between the bass and the next note up is a fourth. And if you remember species counterpoint, right, that fourth is actually a dissonant interval, right? A fourth sounds like it needs to collapse in on itself. Right? The top note of a fourth needs to move down. Well, that fourth is what holds up the rest of the chord. So second inversion triads, they sound like they need to collapse in on themselves like this. Right? So by their nature, they sound like they need to move. Okay, so more than any other position, these triads, the ones in second inversion, sound like they need to resolve to another harmony. And here's another illustration of why, and this goes back to my often cited snowman analogy, right? So if we think of a triad as a snowman, the root of the chord of a root position triad is like the base of the snowman, right? It's like the big, giant snowball you put on the bottom that supports the rest of the chord, right? So that root is the most important, so it's the biggest. And then the next note up is the third. We put that in the middle, right? That should also be big to support what's on top. And then the fifth, the head of the snowman, is the smallest because it's the least important to hold the snowman up, right? So in root position, everything is great because you have the most important note on the bottom, the second most important note in the middle, and then the least important note on top. That's why a root position triad sounds stable. If you flip that, if you take the largest part, the most important part, and you put that on top of the snowman, right? Then the chord becomes a little bit less stable. You still have that third on the bottom, and that third is still important in defining the chord, so it's still able to support the snowman in that position. It's just less stable than root position. Well, if you keep going with this, then you get the really unstable chord, because now the least important note, the note that does the least to define what the chord is now on the bottom. And it's like flipping the snowman upside down, so you have the smallest snowball supporting all the other notes of the chord. So that's another good way to look at it. And you can see from this analogy that snowman is about to fall over. And that's kind of what a second inversion triad is like. Right? It needs to move. Right? It needs to get back into root position. Right? It's going to topple over otherwise. Okay, that's a pretty good analogy. I always like that one. All right, so because of this instability, these second inversion triads are relatively rare. You don't hear them all the time. And they're only used in 4 specific ways. The most important one and the most common is what's called a cadential 6/4. And we're going to talk about all these in detail. The next, probably most common, is the passing 6/4. Then we also have something called a pedal 6/4. And finally, we have what's sometimes called a bass arpeggiation 6/4. So 6/4 just means, it's just shorthand for saying second inversion triad. And we're just saying that these are 4 different types of second inversion triads. They're all different ways that second inversion triads are used in music. And they all create different effects. So let's talk about the bass arpeggiation 6/4. And so this is a little bit similar to how a first inversion triad is used, because we use this to kind of do the same thing, to arpeggiate a triad in the bass. So we call that, when it's used with the 6/4, we call that a arpeggiation 6/4. So here's an incredibly boring piece of music, right? It just has one chord and one bass note. And it doesn't sound too interesting by itself. Right? Just 4 of the same chords. Well, let's say we wanted to make that a little bit more interesting, but still keep it kind of subtle like it is. So we could change the bass line, but we don't want to change the harmony. So one thing we can do is invert that second chord. So now the 5th of the chord is in the bass instead of the root. So it was the root, but now we're inverting it so that the bass line changes, so that now we have the note C in the bass. And we could keep going with this. So that chord there would be our arpeggiation 6/4. And if we kept going, we could make the next one a first inversion triad, and then we could drop the F in the last chord, and we end up with something that's a little bit more interesting. So it gives movement to something that otherwise wouldn't have it. And all we did to make that happen was we inverted the second chord to a second inversion triad, and the third chord to a first inversion triad, and we dropped the octave of the last chord. And now we get an F chord outlined in the bass, which gives this otherwise boring little progression, not even a progression, some life. So that's one way you can use an arpeggiation 6/4. Now, the one that we call the arpeggiation 6/4 is the chord that's the second inversion chord. So this one, if you were to identify it, that would be the arpeggiation 6/4. Okay, great. Let's look at another use of this kind of inversion, and that's the pedal 6/4. And this kind of does the opposite of what we just saw. So this creates tension by repeating a bass note, but allowing the harmony to change above it. And it's called a pedal 6/4 because of what like a church organ does, right? A church organ, one technique is to hold a bass note and repeat it, and you do that by literally pressing down a pedal, right? And it creates this kind of effect. So just repeating the same bass note, and you can see that kind of creates an interesting, almost tense kind of sound, right? So how does this work? Why do we say it's a 6/4? Well, in this case, right, here's an example in the key of F again, where we have kind of a standard root position bass line. We have our bass note moving down to a B flat, back up to an F, and then back up to a G. So it sounds like this. But let's say we want to change that bass line and maybe create a little bit of a different effect in this part of the music. Well, we can do that by inverting that second chord from a 4 root position to a 4/6/4, right? A second inversion triad. So we're just taking what was the B flat in the bass, right? The root position triad, and we're changing it by moving the bass note up to an F, but keeping the same harmony. Because when you invert that B flat chord, the note that's on the bottom, the note that's the bass, is the note F. And so now we have a different effect. Sort of like a little passive, like, calming effect, kind of. Right? So just by changing that root position 4 chord to a first or second inversion 4 chord, it creates a much different musical effect. Okay, so that's called a pedal 6/4, and when you would identify that, you would see the repeated bass note, and you see that one of them is a 6/4 chord. So that's how you know that it's a pedal 6/4 chord. Okay. Another way you can use a 6/4, a second inversion triad, is as a passing 6/4 chord. And this, like first inversion triads do, it allows stepwise movement in the bass, right? So here's another bass line that jumps around a lot because it is all root position triads. And let me play it. Right, so you have that jumping bass line. Well, we can change the effect of that bass line by making it stepwise, and we do that by using inverted triads. And so we'll take that 5 chord, which is the second chord, and we'll invert it so that the note G is in the bass, and that makes it a second inversion 5 chord. And we can keep going with this and turn that 1 chord into a 1/6 chord, and I'll rearrange it so that I'm not doubling the third. And now we have a much different effect. And that's really great sound. Right before, it was very leapy and not a very smooth bass line. But we can change that by inverting the chords, and we get this sort of counterpoint effect. Which has, I think, a nice sort of pushing forward effect, much more than the leaping bass line. So nice sound with that too. So this is called a passing 6/4, and you can recognize them because our bass line looks like it's moving upwards. It's passing through 2 notes, right, to get to a new destination, and it's a second inversion triad. Okay, so this would be our passing 6/4 chord. Another thing to notice is that these are often used in conjunction with first inversion triads. So the counterpoint is not created just by a 6/4 chord, but also the other inversions too. So the point is not really that we're inverting the chord, it's that we're creating contrary stepwise motion, right, between our soprano and our bass. We have contrary motion by step, right? Just like we learned was important with counterpoint. So, okay, so it's not really the chords we're doing, we're altering the melodic aspects of the bass line. Okay. And then finally, the most important one is called the cadential 6/4 chord. And this is the most common because it happens all the time. And its effect is to delay the movement to the final 5 chord at a cadence. Okay, so let's show you what that means. So a cadence is, as you remember from counterpoint, is just the ending of a piece of music, right? And we'll learn more about the different kinds of cadences when you're talking about full-fledged harmonies a little bit later. But for now, I've typically structured all of our assignments so that they end with this kind of cadence where we move from a 5 chord to a 1 chord. And that's probably the most common, the strongest kind of cadence, right? So this is the ending of a piece. Now, right now, we have sort of a movement from the tonic to the subdominant to the tonic to the dominant and then to the tonic. So kind of a back and forth movement from tonic, subdominant, tonic, dominant, tonic, right? So that kind of sounds like this. Which is fine, that's a perfectly fine effect. But what if we wanted to make this sound like we don't get to that tonic until we get to the end, right? Because right now, it kind of sounds like we're starting one place, we're moving somewhere else, we're going back, and then going somewhere else, and then coming back. But what if we wanted to sound more like we're starting on our tonic, we're moving away from it, then we're getting even further away, then we finally get to the thing that points us back, and then we end up back on our tonic, right? So we don't want this back and forth motion. Instead, we want a movement that's more clearly towards the dominant, right? But we can't do that with a 1 chord because that's a tonic sound. So how can we change this? Well, the way we can do this is by using a cadential 6/4 chord, right? So instead of going kind of back and forth between tonic, 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 we're going to instead kind of increase the tension, kind of increase the movement away from the tonic by changing the inversion of that third chord there, that 1 chord. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn it into a second inversion chord, right? A 1/6/4 chord. And I'll play it and you can hear what I mean from that effect. So we have our tonic chord. So now by making that change, that 1/6/4 chord really doesn't sound like a tonic chord anymore, right? And in fact, by putting it in inversion and making it be followed by a 5 chord, we really make it sound more like a dominant harmony, okay? So these inversions can have a profound effect on the function of the chord, right? So now our movement is more like tonic, subdominant, and then we arrive on our dominant here, and then we stay on that dominant, and we end up back on our tonic. So now we have more of a direction, more of a forward direction from the tonic to a place away from the tonic, and then a return to the tonic, right? As opposed to going back and forth like we were before. Okay, so importantly, I think it's worth noting that this effect, this 1/6/4, is really special. So it changes a otherwise tonic chord into a dominant chord. Okay, let me play that one more time. Okay, so that's how a 1/6/4 happens at a cadence. And when it happens at a cadence, we call it a cadential 6/4. And it's really important. It happens a lot in classical music and a lot of pop music too. So another important thing to remember about the cadential 6/4 is that it resolves in a specific way. And you'll see that I made the voice leading really smooth. So whenever you have a 6/4 chord, you have to remember that the 6th of the chord, right, which would be A, moves down to become the 5th of the next chord. So 6 always moves to 5, right? And then the 4, this note F, always moves down to become the 3rd of the next chord. So 6 moves to 5 and 4 moves to 3. And that is the most common movement of the voices in a 6/4 chord. And that's what we have to do when we use them, right? So 6 moves down to 5, right? So that A moves down to G, and the 4th moves down to a 3rd, so that F moves to an E. So whenever you have a cadential 6/4, you have to make sure that 6 moves to 5 in the next chord, 4, the first chord, moves to the 3 of the second chord. Okay? All right. And we'll see that there's another way to close the gap between this as well, right? So we can move to that B flat, but we'll talk about that later, not now. Okay. So, great. That's the different kinds of 6/4 chords, the different kind of second inversion triads. Now we need to be able to identify what these are in figured bass. So let's talk about how we indicate them in figured bass. And it's very straightforward. Any second inversion triad is indicated by a bass note and then the number 6 and 4. And it's up to you to recognize which kind of second inversion triad is being used and compose the other voices accordingly, just like when we were doing first inversion triads. So here is our example, and you'll see we have 3 6/4 chords, 3 second inversion triads, one here, and one here. Okay? And so you can recognize them by their context. I can see that this 6/4 chord seems like it moves from one note to this note and then passes along to the next note. So this is our passing 6/4 chord. And I know that just by looking at how the bass moves. Okay? Here, it looks like this B flat is being used to repeat the same note, right? So whenever we repeat the same bass note and there's a 6/4 involved, we call this a pedal 6/4, a repeated bass note 6/4. And then this 6/4 looks like it's at the very end, right? It's at a cadence. So whenever the 6/4 appears at a cadence, we call it a cadential 6/4. So I don't really know like what I'm going to write above these, but I can just recognize these three different types of 6/4 chords based on what the bass is doing. And that's kind of the skill that we need to have. So when you're asked to identify what they are, you can really do that before you even write any notes above this, right? Okay. And then a reminder of what the figured bass means specifically, which is only the intervals of an octave, a sixth, and a 4 can be used in these chords, right? So just a refresher, when there's no notes, right, when there's no numbers, we can use octave, fifth, and third. When there's a 6, we can use octave, 6, and third. And when there's a 6/4 chord, we can use octave, 6, and 4. Okay? All right. So let's talk about what happens when you're writing in 4 parts like we'll be doing for our figured bass. Well, there's only 3 notes in the chord, so the question is always, what do you double? What's the best thing to double in a second inversion triad? And the rule is always what results in the best voice leading, right? But if we just think about the chord, the best note to double is the bass note, the lowest note of the chord, which is the 5th of the chord. Well, why is that? Well, let's look at our snowman again, right? So this is our unstable snowman with the 5th on the bottom, right? There's not much supporting it. But if we double that 5th, that unstable tone, it helps prop up the chord a little bit more, right? It gives some more weight to that note that's unimportant, right? By repeating it. So it gives this chord a little bit more stability, right? It gives a little bit more of a chance to prop up that root in that 3rd chord. So that's why it's best to double the bass of the chord typically. Okay, so here's an example of how I would approach a figured bass like I had just talked about. And I'm mostly just going to focus on the soprano line because I think writing the inner voices is something we are able to do. But let's look at this. So you always want to compose your soprano first, and you want to identify the different kinds of 6/4 chords. And we did this already. So we saw that this 6/4, right, is a note that passes in between this note and this note. So whenever you have a note that passes in between 2 other notes, we call that a passing chord or passing tone. So this is our passing 6/4 chord. So I'll write that in here. This is going to be our passing 6/4. And passing notes just mean we have an opportunity to do some kind of counterpoint, right? Over here, this was a repeated bass note with a second inversion triad in the middle. And whenever you have a repeated bass note, we call that a pedal 6/4, a pedal second inversion, right? And this just means that the harmony is going to change around this bass note. Okay, and we'll deal with that in a second. Now, this one, our 6/4 at the cadence, right? Whenever it's at a cadence, we call it a cadential 6/4. And I know that since it's cadential 6/4, that means that my 6 is going to need to resolve to 5 in the next chord, and my 4 is going to need to resolve to 3 in the next chord, okay, and then go on to resolve. So by knowing what kind of 6/4s these are, we kind of know what to do in our soprano and our inner voices, right? Okay, so let's start this at the beginning. This is a passing 6/4, and I see that it goes from a B flat to a D. Well, like I said, a passing chord gives us an opportunity to create counterpoint, stepwise contrary motion, possibly between the soprano and the bass. So maybe my soprano line could go D down to C and then end up on a B flat. And do those intervals work? Well, I can have 8-5-3 in this first chord, and the note D is my 3rd, so that checks out. I can have 8, 6, and 4, and that note C I wrote there is an octave above the C, so that checks out. And then in this chord I can have 8, 6, and 3, and that B flat I wrote is my 6, so that checks out too. Okay. From there, I could maybe move just, these are two, well, the next one's a root position triad, so I can have 8, 5, and 3 again. And I want to create contrary motion whenever I can, so maybe my B flat can move up to a C. Well, a C is a second above B flat, so that will not work. So we can't move to the C. So we can go in the upwards direction maybe by a leap. And so I could leap up to maybe a D, skip that C. And so that D gives me a third, which works fine. Okay, now I have a 6-4 chord, my pedal 6-4. So I'm going to want everything to kind of move around that note B flat. Well, let's look at what happens. So this is going to be oblique motion, right? So our bass note's going to stay the same, and all of our other voices are going to move in some direction against that same movement, right? So oblique motion, like we've done in counterpoint. Well, let's see what our options are. We can move to an octave. If we do that, we can get to a B flat, but that's not really stepwise motion, right? So let's not do that. A sixth would be a G. That's a leap. That's not something we want to do. Our final option is the fourth, and a fourth is an E flat. So that would be stepwise, and that would move upwards. So let's use that. So we'll go to the E flat. And our next chord, 8, 5, and 3 again. And since we're sort of trying to create oblique motion, maybe we can go in the opposite direction. So let's return to the note D. All right. So now we come up on our cadential 6-4, and the intervals I'm allowed to use are 8, 6, and 4. And so, let's see, octave would be the note F. I guess we could go to that. Let's see what our options are. One is to go to the 6, which is the note D. So that would be a repeat of the note we just had. So let's do that. It's always good to repeat notes. All right. Now I know what I need to do, because that 6 I just wrote, remember, has to resolve to the 5th of the next chord. And the 5th of the next chord is the note C. So that needs to go to a C. And then I can have contrary motion at the cadence, and I end up back on my octave, B flat. So there you go. I composed a soprano line just knowing how those 6-4 chords work. And when you harmonize it, it kind of turns out like this. See if I can make this up. Apparently not. Let's try that again. All right, it took some thought. Let me do that again. And you could go in and write these inner voices, which you do have to do in your assignment, but I'm not going to spend our time doing that right now. Let's look at how we would analyze this with our Roman numerals, because that is always the final step with these things, or the first step, depending on how you like to roll. So we want to look at the bass and the inversion number, right? So if it's a B flat without any numbers under it, it's a root position triad. So that means that our first chord is a 1 chord in the key of B flat major. This is a second inversion triad with C in the bass, which means that my root is a 5th below that. So my root is the note F. And F in the key of B flat is a 5. So this is a 5, 6, 4 chord. My next note is a D with a 6 under it. So that means that my root of this chord is a 3rd below that. So my chord here is B flat, so that's a 1 chord with a 6, so 1, 6. Then I have a B flat with no numbers under it. That's another root position 1 chord. Here I have a B flat with a 6, 4 under it, which means that my root is going to be a fifth below that note. So that's an E flat, and then the key of B flat major, the note E flat is the fourth degree of the scale. So this will be Roman numeral 4, and it will be 4, 6, 4. Then we return to a B flat with no numbers under it. That's like we've had before, a 1 chord in root position. Then we have an F with a 6, 4 under it, which means that the root of this chord is a fifth below that, which is B flat. And it's a cadential 6, 4, so we can just call it a 1, 6, 4, but we also know that it's not a tonic chord, right? And then we have an F note with no notes under it. So F is the fifth degree of the scale of B flat. So that's our 5. And then we return to our B flat 1 chord. Okay, there you go. So I didn't even really think about shape too much. I guess I did, but I really thought about how these 6/4 chords work, right? I thought about the fact that we have a passing 6/4 chord here. And so I wrote my soprano line to have contrary motion to take advantage of that. I knew that I had a pedal 6/4 here. So I wrote my soprano to kind of have stepwise oblique motion with that sustained note in the pedal. And then I knew I had a cadential 6/4 here. So I followed the formula for 6/4 chords, which is to go 6 down to 5, 4 down to 3, right? Okay, there you go. Thanks for watching. That was hopefully riveting to watch. I'm sure it was. Great, well, thanks so much, and we'll be doing more of this in class, so have a great day, everybody.